I think we can start. Welcome everyone to today's GLP Telecoupling Working Group webinar on the topic of prioritizing partners and products for the sustainability of the EU's agri-food trade. Thank you so much for your patience. We are really looking forward to this talk. Our speaker today is Yves Zingrebe from the Helmholtz Centre for Environmental Research in Germany. And this webinar is organized, as I said, by the GLP Working Group on Telecoupling Research towards Sustainable Transformation of Land Systems. With me here today are the co-coordinators of this working group with Johanna Könen and Maria Jose Ibarola Rivas, and Cecilia Fries is another of the coordinators of this working group. Before we start with the topic, I'd like to share a little bit of information on our working group. So it's a platform to provide opportunities for interdisciplinary exchange around the topic of telecoupling that's always evolving, and consolidating knowledge on methodological, conceptual, and empirical issues related to this topic. It's also an opportunity to bring together early career and more senior scientists working on the topic. And as the main activities for now, we have these webinars ongoing. We have a newsletter that we send out about 4 times a year. We have blog posts on the topics of these webinars. And we are also hosting a session at the upcoming Open Science meeting of the GLP in Oaxaca in Mexico next month on telecoupled impacts, feedbacks, and spillovers of international and transnational policies and governance initiatives. So if you're planning to attend the conference, we of course hope to see you there. And probably there will also be some informal networking activities with other members of the working group present at the conference. If you're a member of this working group, then please feel free to share additional ideas for collaboration with us. If you have an idea for a webinar in the future, please reach out to us. We're always happy to organize such webinars. And if you're not a member yet, then please subscribe to the link that Johanna has put in the chat if you'd like to become one. We'd be happy to see you as a new member in our group. So with that, I would like to give the word to Yves, and I'm looking forward to his talk.
Yes, thank you very much, Julie. Let's see how I can share the right screen. Perhaps this is not the first slide. Maybe we start with that one. And no, it's the wrong presentation, sorry. Yeah. Too many screens, really challenge. So now you could see my screen.
Yes, that looks good. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thanks a lot. So if I come across anything that you find is strange, please shoot and ask me a question right away, and I can clarify things, and maybe the overall conceptual things we can leave for a discussion at the end. So I want to start, since I'm new to this community, and thank you very much for giving me the chance to present here. I want to maybe use the first slide to say something about our work here at U of Z. So I have a bit of a mixed background. I started with biotechnology, went over to environmental policy, and have written my PhD on Peruvian biodiversity governance. That's why I always somehow in between the worlds, Latin America and Europe. I spent way too much time on the IPBES report on transformative change and the EU land use policies, biodiversity strategies and policy integrations, as well as science policy interfaces. And now telecoupling governance have become like key themes of my work. We've formed a nice little working group here at U of Z on biodiversity governance, which has different projects related to finding governance solutions for a transformation towards a stronger protection of biodiversity and nature. And and we're also, or at least Diego Brizuela and I are going to Oaxaca, and we're happy to continue discussing these issues there and to link up with other people interested in these topics. And yeah, where does my motivation for this work come from? So in 2017, we have written a fitness check on the European agricultural policy. And one theme that we had to deal with was policy coherence and the actual trade-off of taking more and more land out of production for conservation or for other purposes in Europe, while observing what you can see on this slide on the left corner, which is that Europe here in the light green shadow, you might have seen this figure before, is importing half of its biocapacity that it needs. So the capacity it needs to fulfill its own needs and consumption from other parts of the world. So it has some effects there and likely increases competition for land use in other places of the world. At the same time, we have observed that like when we look at Amazon deforestation, that we have drastic changes in the rates. For example, here in 2005 and 2006, where deforestation decreased significantly for the first time. And I don't want to see the graphs coming after 2019 though. But when I asked experts, or more specifically Eduardo Viola and Joana Pereira, on the causes why it actually decreased in that time, it was mainly because of trade relations and sustainability appearing in trade relations, and also about enforcement policies at the same time, which also were, however, also part of this multilateral process. So in other words, we have a consumption that is linked to other parts of the world, and we have changes in ecological quality and quantity that is linked to consumptions in other parts. So telecouplings connect distant coupled social ecological systems through material, immaterial flows and feedback loops. And I think part of these feedback loops are also political and economic relations that sometimes get lost when you look at only the material flows of things. And well, then when we look at the EU, or rather at the world, we have this idea of policy coherence for sustainable development, so that all the policies or global interventions are sometimes meant to support sustainable development goals. And in the European context, it more specifically means that the Consensus for Development, how it's called in the EU, commits the European Union with all their foreign policies or relevant policies to assure that there's a support for specifically low and least developed countries in meeting their SDGs. And there's also commitments in addressing external effects in farm to fork strategy, biodiversity strategy, Green Deal, and so on and so forth, which we might know. So the motivation was, well, before we can evaluate where what policy recommendations could actually come out of it, maybe we would have to have a better idea of what is actually imported and what trade relationships we're actually linked to. So what we've done is looking, since we came from this agricultural policy perspective, we also looked at cropland first, and we looked at monetary imports of cropland products based on FAO data, and area-based implications of imports in terms of land use footprint and imported deforestation, also from existing databases. And we analyzed them in two criteria. One is relevance, which is the share of overall import into the EU. So if you take the overall cropland product import into the EU, then like a specific product or a specific country importing into the EU would be relevant according to the share of the overall import. Yeah, is that intuitive? And then the second dimension is leverage, which is the share of the either country of origin or the product we're looking at. So, for example, when we look at cacao imports, then how much of the overall cacao produced in the global south goes to the EU? That's the leverage they have in the value chain of cacao. And how much of the cropland products in a certain country X are imported into the EU. That's the leverage, assuming that the higher this share is, the more market power would the EU have in establishing regulatory safeguards or standards. And our research question was, how can the EU prioritize its trade relations according to these two dimensions, relevance and leverage? And what are resulting policy implications? So looking at the data for products, so we did that for products and countries. Looking at the products, and here you see the same figure. So this is the import value for products. You see that there's a high relevance value, especially for soybeans, and a very high leverage in economic value for cocoa here. Whereas in land use footprint, it's quite similar. The soybeans are here, and then there's cocoa, also not as extreme, but also a very high leverage value here. And I just realized I haven't used the last version of this slide because soybean and palm oil don't appear here, but they are just through the roof. So they are like higher than 30%. That's why they don't appear on this, and I haven't exchanged these. Sorry about that. But if you look at the article, there's the latest version of that. And if we just look at the relevance, for example, for deforestation, we see that over 80% of deforestation can actually be attributed to 4 products: oil palm, soy, coffee, and cacao, or cocoa, however you want to call it. So it's not as complex as we think to identify the key drivers of deforestation in the European context. But when it comes to trade relationships, trade agreements, and bilateral agreements, then it's countries who deal with each other usually. For those of you who have worked in production areas, I mean, when we look at it from the consumption perspective, we always think in value chains. But if we look at the production system, then it's not only one product that is produced in a certain region, mostly, but that there's different opportunities for the farmers. It's a bit about looking at the context in that country. And if we look at the relevance here, we can also see that Brazil has a very high for both monetary and land footprint values, and that there's other countries. I will come back to them as the ACPs, more sugar exporters, because they are very strongly characterized by their sugar exports. They have a very high leverage because they produce a lot for the EU because of these preferential trade access. And for deforestation, yeah, Indonesia has a very significant relevance value here, but yeah, like a leverage of 10% is still important. And what we've done then is characterize countries according to their product portfolio, because there's countries that have a similar product portfolio that might be linked to their geographic location or the other similar characteristics, but in some cases also because of simply the comparative advantage they've looked for, so for the niche in the global market. For example, the coffee and cacao specialists are a bit distributed across partly Latin America, Africa, so Western Africa, and I think Vietnam is one of the strong coffee producers. Yeah, and then we find out that again, like it's these three groups of countries that make up a lot of the deforestation, but also a large share of the imported land use. And that when looking at these, we need to look at those like the bilateral, multilateral relationships that we have with them and take that into account. And we've also mapped this, which is quite challenging, having like these different considerations visualized in a map. If you have a better idea for how to do that, feel free to share it with us. But what we've done is we've color-coded the countries according to like this product portfolio, so you can see where they're located in the world. And like the size of the dots are the relevance, and the color of the dots are the leverage values, just to get an idea there. So basically, looking at relevance and leverage means you have to look for the big dots and the red dots. Yeah. So now moving to the policy implications. Well, the most obvious thing is to look at relevance. So simply reduce the effect or the land use that you have to import in other places to reduce the potential adverse effect that you can have. And that can be done by reducing, I mean, a lot is imported for feed and energy. A lot of the demands that we have is for feed and energy, the type of diets we have. So that's important levers that can be used. I'm not saying that it has to be done or that's the only ones, but it's a powerful lever. And I think all sustainability reports agree on that. There's always this like race, well, I'll come to this in a second, but there's this race to the bottom, you know, that this theory that production or extraction will always move to the country that has the lowest regulations. And then there's a lot of, I mean, for example, with agricultural policy, there's this pressure on farmers to say like, well, you need to compete on a global market, but we have those social standards, we have those environmental standards. That's why we subsidize them. But maybe another opportunity would be to introduce carbon border taxes or like compensation taxes on an import, which wouldn't even be against WTO regimes, because it would be no discrimination, but rather setting the same standards for all products sold in a certain country. There's currently a lot going on in terms of value chain regulation, like the EU due diligence regulation. There's also been some experiences in the renewable energy policy, especially with palm oil, and that picture shows yeah, I took that photo out of a plane flying above Kalimantan, which is the Indonesian part of Borneo. And you can see how the straight lines of the palm plantation kind of eats into the remaining forest there. And I think the example of palm oil also illustrates how relevance and leverage are a bit of a trade-off. Because in that example, the EU established strong import policies or regulations on palm oil. And the result was that they kind of gave up their market power, and that the production remained increasing, but simply going to different markets. And then they lost the opportunity to establish reasonable sustainability safeguards that maybe could have ended up spilling over to other producers if it would have been introduced in a different way. It's always easy to say that afterwards, though. Yeah, that comes to the second point of leverage. So there's a lot of critique going on to the common agricultural policy, or for distorting markets and producing products that are wasted, and thereby reducing the potential of developing countries to import into the EU and to compete with them. And we found that especially new trade regimes, such as economic partnerships agreement, EPA, the general systems of preferences, or there's different types of trade regimes. Those are old ones. But what they've shown is that if not carefully designed, they produce an extra income, so a rent for these least developed countries, by having a preferential trade access to a powerful market such as the EU. And then if you reduce the market barriers, this preferential trade access actually loses its value, right? So, and that means if you reduce trade barriers without finding a compensation for those least developed countries, they're worse off, and it's going to be other transitioning countries that benefit from it. So it shifts the power. So we need to be cautious that when we establish regulations, especially with this strong market power or leverage, we will have secondary effects in generating winners and losers. And it also has this geopolitical implications, as we can see now with the Ukraine war. We're not trading in an independent market somewhere, but it's linked to real life people and real life places. And even the debates of agricultural policies in that time, or like food policies, had a strong linkage to these geopolitical conflicts, and have to be considered together, because there was, I think it was food security again, which is always a strong narrative for lobbying for intensification, that has been taken up again and in that time. Yeah, that's the leverage part. And then the third policy implication or theme that we emphasize in the article is that sustainability requires complementary policies in both producing and consuming countries, because you have secondary effects, and private market initiatives such as certification can support certain dimensions of sustainability, but might have limitations and adverse effects. And those adverse effects can be scale effects, that you, for example, have simply a a sustainable production system in one place, but as soon as it scales into ecological valuable areas, or it just booms, and then it's no longer sustainable. You can have the spillover effects. I took this picture in Pará. I always thought that soy production was in the south of Brazil, but apparently it moved to the Amazon. And it can be that there's, if we trace supply chains, then we certify something that is in an area that comes from an area that is not in deforested land, but pushes the production for domestic consumption into other areas, right? Or even other products. So we have to be mindful of these spillover effects. There's a lot of debates going on about this monitoring. There's this business monitoring directive in the Convention on Biological Diversity. The monitoring of businesses is an important aspect that is debated everywhere, but to me, an elephant in the room is what data, what are they actually supposed to be monitoring or reporting, and who's producing this information? Because as you always have this context where you might have these secondary effects, there might need to be some sort of reference, like where is agricultural lands, where is forests, so that you can then demonstrate in your business monitoring where your product actually comes from, and that source needs to be legitimized in a way that it's credible to consumers. And so it's hard to do that with only the business itself, but it calls for partnerships. And yeah, this ignoring the landscape and the social context, a product is not only the production itself, but the effect it has on its environment. And experiences with certification and reporting obligations have shown that it might reduce especially small players from the access to markets. So that's why usually it's not like a one silver bullet, but like a package of solutions that have to be found. So to conclude, yeah, the EU has a high potential to contribute to global sustainability, but it needs to be aware of, obviously, not to be blamed for a different sort of post-colonialism, because it has this lever. It can go into different directions. Relevance identifies magnitudes and guides us to trade relations that can really have an effect on the overall magnitude of the EU external impacts, and leverage identifies the EU's regulatory potential, and closely connected to that, its responsibility if it takes the policy coherence for development seriously. And the last point is what I showed in my last slide, that telecoupled agri-food systems need complementary policies and therefore depend on bi- and multilateral trade relations. Yeah, and that links also to this, maybe to this thought of maybe if you have looked at telecoupling governance, you've seen that NEVIC paper on the different types of governance systems. So usually the governance systems that cause the telecoupled effects are different ones from the ones that solve it, and different ones from the ones that manage it. And therefore, these bi- and multilateral relationships need to take into account all three of them. Yeah, that's it for my presentation.
Thanks so much, Yves, for a very clear and interesting talk. Are there any questions from our audience? Please feel free to speak up or write into the chat as you prefer. Maybe while we wait, also if my colleagues have any questions for you.
Yes, I do. I don't want to, if anyone
Yes, Johanna, please go ahead.
if anybody
start
wants
the
to
discussion.
don't want to take the floor, but yeah, so I have one question of understanding and one more follow-up question. So my question of understanding is like, because you have this relevance and leverage the factors basically, or what you calculated, and do I understand you correctly that the relevance values would point to areas where the EU should work on reducing its consumption rather than working with international partners, and then the leverage values would point towards areas where the EU could work on its international policies, so that the relevance is helping us to identify areas and commodities where EU can or should work on reducing consumption. I'm not sure if I got that right from one of the slides. It was more like an interpretation.
Well, thanks for the question, and it's a bit confusing at the beginning, but as soon as you get your hand around it, it took us also a while to understand it, but that it's not separate areas. Like it's not like one area has a relevance value and another one a leverage value. Actually, most of the areas with very high relevance have also a considerable leverage value you can work with. It's just like if the EU wants to improve its own performance, so kind of reduce the overall impact it has on the outside, it can be guided by relevance. And if you want to identify where it actually has the strongest impact in like producing a change, then it can be guided by leverage. For example, Mauritius will probably not have a strong relevance for the EU's PCD performance because it's a very small country, but in a responsible relationship with Mauritius, the EU can have a strong role in helping Mauritius or collaborating. I mean, it's a cooperation in both directions to develop sustainably.
Okay, okay. I think thanks. That clarifies it, and that links also to my second question, would be related to the EU regulation on deforestation-free products, which of course has been adopted and will enter into force soon. So, what can you draw policy implications from your study for the EUDR implementation in terms of international cooperation, because the EUDR has a chapter on international cooperation, and now we need to prioritize with whom we want to collaborate and establish this international cooperation in the EU regulation on deforestation-free products. What would be your can you draw any policy implications from your study for EUDR implementation?
Well, I'm not an expert on that policy, but I've come across it, and I think it's with most of those complex policies that you won't establish an implementation procedure that will be effective from the beginning, right? And you need some sort of a trial error, and therefore you need pilot partnerships, and it could make a lot of sense to use relevance and leverage for identifying these partnerships and to start implementing them there. And I would guess that, or I'm convinced that only having a regulation in the EU doesn't solve the problem, but it needs these complementary solutions in the countries of origin. And that's why, I would still emphasize this need to work on partnerships and have them identified in relevance and leverage.
Thank you. I see we have a question or comment from Marcella. Please go ahead.
Hello. Well, it's linked to the question of Joanna, and part of the answer Eve already gave. You had in your conclusion slide this very nice sentence: this agri-food telecoupling needs more policy. I'm involved in a process in Ecuador where they are also concerned about how they are adopting the deforestation-free directive and which implications does it have, for example, for cocoa and many other products they are exporting. And one of the perception or the main perception of the producers is that it is increasing a lot the transaction cost they have, and is therefore worsening off people in Ecuador in this particular case. Do you see room for an interaction? Because I mean, this European directive is like a kind of, okay, it's very nice intentions and responsibility and so on, but it's kind of top-down regulation that countries will have to implement. And when you look at who is gaining the most across the value chain, it's not precisely the people who will bear the cost of the whole implementation. So, and people from Ecuador, from the government were also saying, okay, this is the directive, even we adopt it and we can export, or we just block our exportation. So do you see room for a bilateral agreement about how to implement and how to distribute the cost of this implementation of the, for example, deforestation-free directive?
I think that's absolutely necessary. Unless, like, if they don't do it, then they have social implications, and it's a completely simplified way of looking at the world in countries, right? Because there's different people in the countries that have very different power and different influence or opportunities to contribute to a changing world. And yeah, I at the same time, I see the point that you know, we're already causing this deforestation, and we just want to clean up what we're doing from a European perspective. But I would say that it needs, and the CBD, for example, would be a perfect arena for discussing these things, right? And then adjusting it. But it would probably require another group of actors that help those people. I mean, if you need to do the monitoring, you can also shift these monitoring obligations or the transaction costs to a third party that takes care of registering where the products are coming from. So it's not up to the small producers to do that. So it's a lot of about how you organize that, I would say.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat by Marcellus. Marcellus, would you like to ask the question directly?
Sure.
Is that okay?
Thanks. Ives was a great presentation. I really like, you know, what you were talking about. So one thing that came to my mind, you know, look at your graph, was the different products, you know, and it seems that we are looking at the aggregate of the products and not look at where they are produced inside the country. Now look at soybeans. Now we are showing a picture of soybeans in the Amazon, probably Santarém, you know, south of Pará. But, you know, if you look at coffee, you know, in Brazil, you know, that's another product. Most of the productions is in the south areas that are not being deforested, you know, in the last probably 50, 60 years. But if you look at coffee in the state of Bahia, you know, it's a new production area where there is substituted cocoa by coffee, you know. So, you know, I think that the location inside the country, you know, it's important, you know, things to consider. And the data, when you get the aggregate data, just looking at the product in the specific country is probably masking some of the results. Now, if you look at them of policy, you know, it's like penalize the whole country, you know, for one product. You know, you look at the data. So what do you think about that? So what would be how you can look at this specificity that we see, in the results.
Yeah, I think that's related to, on one hand, these monitoring obligations, but also these like who is responsible for producing this data, right? And my personal view is that I cannot re-emphasize the importance of GBF target 1 again, which is integrated land use planning. So you need a legitimate way to identify where is the place for producing what, and having that established. But it's all across Latin America, at least as far as I know it. It's again these powerful industry lobby that holds the legal background for land use planning and management down. So they're more flexible and expanding and producing, and having this integrated land use planning could simply take this monitoring obligation off of certain people, because they can only do good in degraded areas. It depends on where it is or where it's coming from. But then again, the secondary effects, if you monitor only your production and your place, then maybe you push something else somewhere else. That's why it's important to have this context. And we need to be more innovative, I think, in the monitoring we do, not only counting hectares and as a absolute measure.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. Are there any more questions from the audience? If not for the moment, maybe I allow myself to ask something that came to mind. Basically, you did this analysis for the EU. What about if you would do that for like other big importing countries or regions, and then to see like who actually has what leverage where, and how could then ideally, yeah, maybe the EU and the US or whoever is the other player work together to make sure the policies are aligned?
Yeah, I think
would that be feasible or interesting?
I think one way of taking this research to the next step would be like expanding its geographical expansion, and looking like maybe like in this, they're having like these nice charts where you have like the different producing countries and the receiving countries, and then having relevance and leverage somehow organized there. As we've designed it now, it only works with one consuming system that we put the others in relation to. I'm happy to discuss this further, and but if you want to get a bit, I feel like if we want to take a next step in the regulation opportunities, then it would require the reduction of complexity and zoom in somewhere, which obviously comes at a trade-off with not taking all the interdependencies into account. But I think it's just something completely different to regulate a very short cocoa value chain from regulating a very complex palm oil value chain. And therefore, yeah, either by the countries or by the product, there needs to be some zoom in to find more conclusions, and then zoom out again and test that the hypotheses gained in that case for the other cases. Yeah, I mean,
all right.
Yeah. Whenever I search for telecoupling governance, it's not many papers coming up. So I don't think that debate is very big, but I feel like the governance debate moves into other terminologies. So we're also struggling in finding the right common denominator or common debate, at least, to connect these streams. to build it and to link it.
Yes, will also be interesting to see what comes up at the GLP conference, where concepts and debates have moved. Wonderful. Any last words, questions, comments? Last chance for now. All right, doesn't seem to be the case. Then I would like to thank you, Yves, very much for taking the time and presenting today, and of course our audience for joining and asking interesting questions. And I'm looking forward to seeing many of you in Mexico soon, or then hopefully in one of our future webinars. Thank you and have a good day, afternoon, evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.